In 1870, in the heart of South Carolina, in the city of Charleston, a respected American family was hiding such a terrifying secret that if it had come to light, it would have shaken the religious and moral foundations of the city. What transpired at the Whitmore family church during that cursed summer was so horrifying that the church records were sealed forever, and the few surviving witnesses took their knowledge to their graves. Before we dive into this spine-chilling tale, if you enjoy America's darkest religious secrets and best-kept mysteries, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Like this video and leave a comment telling us which city and country you're watching from. We want to know how far these untold stories have reached. Now, let's begin by recounting the downfall of the Whitmore family's respectable appearance and their dark stories. Carolina in the 1870s was a bit chaotic, and the taxes imposed on citizens by post-Civil War America didn't affect some families much, especially families like the Whitmores, who had earned respect in the region. The eldest of the family, 70-year-old Augustus, with his dirty beard, tall stature, and imposing build despite his age, owned vast cotton fields and fertile farmland in the rural areas of Charleston. The male members of the family were known as one of the largest landowners in the region before the war. With hundreds of workers employed on the land surrounding their estate, they wielded significant influence in the region, both economically and socially. This power was reinforced not only by their land, but also by their faith. Families' ties to the church were particularly strong. Their relationship with Father Montgomery went beyond mere Sunday services. The Whitmores were among the church's largest donors and were known in the community as a devout, moral, and exemplary family. They frequently supported those in need. However, this flawless image was nothing more than a thin veil constructed to conceal a secret hidden deep within. The family lived in a spacious mansion dating back to the 1820s due to their wealth. However, they also owned another property in the southwest of the city that had been unused for many years. Additionally, at the western edge of their vast lands, there was a magnificent church nestled under the shade of towering oak trees. The town of Ashburn, where Gabriel Chapel was located, was filled with mysteries about people who had disappeared in years past. The chapel stood alone among cotton fields. There were also graves belonging to former members of the Whitmore family around the chapel. One day, a letter from Montgomery's daughter, the priest of the church, made him ecstatic. That is, until he read the last part of the letter. Clara had been sent to a school outside the city by her father, Montgomery. As the school year was coming to an end, she had written a letter to her father saying she would be coming home. However, the letter had been written approximately 3 weeks earlier, and due to some issues that arose, it had reached Montgomery much later. Despite the passage of time, his daughter had not yet returned. The next morning, he went to her school to find out what had happened, and was shocked by what he heard. The school principal took a deep breath and said, "Clara was taken from the school about 4 months ago by a person who introduced himself as a relative of your family. However, we have no information about this person's identity or motives. All we know is that this person is a man with long black hair, approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall. Since that day, no one knows where your daughter is. I assumed you were aware of this situation." Montgomery's heart sank. This was an unacceptable secret for him. Not knowing about his daughter's life had damaged his protective instinct toward her. But how could that be? His daughter occasionally wrote him letters and told him she was doing well. This suggested that someone else was writing those letters to prevent Montgomery from worrying. Montgomery needed help to find his daughter. He went to the Whitmore family's mansion, as they were major supporters of the church. The family received Montgomery in the grand hall. The crystal chandelier cast its warm light onto the velvet sofas, wooden carvings, and the cross in the corner. Augustus leaned on his cane as he looked at the man who had come. "Why did you want to see me, Montgomery?" he asked, his voice tired but attentive. Montgomery pulled out a few folded letters from his pocket. "My daughter, she disappeared months ago, but during this time, letters have continued to arrive for me. The handwriting resembles hers, but the warmth in her heart is missing. My instincts tell me these lines are not hers." Augustus furrowed his brows. His son Nathaniel, sitting next to him, shifted slightly in his seat and looked away. At that moment, Montgomery noticed the change in his hair. The young man, once known for his long, striking black hair, now had hair so short it was almost a military cut. After listening carefully to Montgomery's words, Augustus slowly shook his head. "This is a serious matter," he said. "I knew your daughter. She was a moral, beautiful, and kind-hearted young woman. The fact that she is still writing after such a disappearance could be the work of someone trying to create a false sense of peace. Montgomery took a step closer. "I want you to help me. I have to find her. I have to think like a detective now, not like a father." Augustus was silent for a moment, then tapped the floor with his cane. "I will help you, Montgomery. But if we get involved in this, dirty secrets may come to light. Things we don't want everyone to know." Nathaniel suddenly stood up. "Father, this isn't our business. We're just trying to help." Augustus turned his eyes to his son. "Nathaniel," he said, his voice thickening, "Montgomery is our friend. We can't withhold our help from him." Montgomery felt grateful for the interest shown by the Whitmore family. His doubts were still alive, but Augustus' promise of help had given him hope. He decided to go to Gabriel Chapel, owned by the Whitmore family, to express his gratitude and seek some inner peace. The next morning, in foggy weather, he arrived at the old stone church between the fields. The door was ajar. As he quietly stepped inside, he was met with a scene that sent a chill down his spine, illuminated by the dim light of candles. In the center of the small domed chapel, Augustus Whitmore and his son, Nathaniel, were kneeling on the ground, praying to an incomprehensible melody. But this was not a prayer. It was more like a ritual. On their faces was not so much reverence as a wild trance. Their eyes were half closed. The words coming from their lips were harsh, and high-pitched hymns in an unknown language echoed off the walls. At that moment, Montgomery believed that these sounds were not prayers, but a call. The air was filled with the warm scent of beeswax mixed with incense, and at that moment, his eyes fell on the altar. On the stone altar, a body surrounded by candles lay there. Montgomery's heart raced. This was someone he knew. Of course. It was Lenora, the 20-year-old daughter of one of the partners of the nearby Earnhardt estate. Her eyes were closed, but her face... there was something odd about it. Her pallor was beyond natural. Her face was smooth like wax, lifeless, yet still warm as if... He looked as if he were sleeping, but Montgomery was almost certain that his eyes would never open again. At that moment, someone entered through the back door, a man with a long black robe and gray beard, Father Aldous. He was holding an old goblet adorned with gold filigree. He approached the altar with heavy steps, then knelt down. He then murmured words that resembled Latin, but which Montgomery could not understand in any way. Augustus and Nathaniel joined him, nodding their heads in rhythm with the hymn. Montgomery's throat tightened. His feet began to move backward. He slowly walked away from the chapel, then couldn't help but start running. His heart was filled with horror, not just from what he had seen, but from what he had felt. What if something like this had happened to his own daughter? What these men were doing wasn't a prayer. It was something else. Not a worship, but an offering. Those images kept replaying in his mind all day long. At dinner, when he asked his family where Lenora Earnhardt was, they told him she had left early that morning to go north to her aunt's house in Modena. Supposedly, she was going to take cooking lessons there. Montgomery shook his head, but a storm raged inside him. He had seen that girl. He didn't know if she was asleep or dead, but she was lying on a stone table in the chapel. He was sure of that. The next evening, Montgomery listened only to his suspicions. Taking his flashlight and an old notebook with him, he set out to investigate the area around Whitmore Church. This time, he approached the mansion through the forest. A thick fog had settled, and the sounds of birds had given way to rustling. But when he couldn't see the mansion, he headed toward the church. This time, he saw a light rising from the church. As he approached the church, he witnessed a horrific sight inside. This time, lying on the altar, was Marielle Rinaldi, the miller's daughter from the village. Everyone thought she had gone outside the city to receive religious education. Montgomery, however, now knew the truth. The girl had not gone anywhere. But Montgomery did not dare tell anyone about what had happened. He thought that no one would believe him, given that the Whitmore family was such a respectable family. What's more, he didn't want to anger the Whitmore family, because they were the ones paying his salary. FKA 6. Montgomery hadn't slept a wink all night. What he had seen had stuck in his mind like rust. At first light, still wearing his priest's robe and holding his rosary, he began walking toward the mansion. This time, despite the fear that had taken hold of him, he would not back down. Augustus and Nathaniel were in the breakfast room as usual, the long table, the silver cutlery, the faint steam rising from the tea. Everything seemed normal from the outside. But for Montgomery, nothing in this house was normal anymore. When he appeared at the door, Augustus looked over his glasses. "Ah, Montgomery, it's a pleasant surprise to see you here at this hour." Nathaniel, as usual, merely bowed his head in greeting. His eyes were fixed on the pattern of the table, as if searching for some evidence in the house. Montgomery moved forward slowly. He placed his hand over his heart and made the sign of the cross, then did not sit down. He stood before the two men. "I have some questions about last night." After a brief silence, Augustus slowly placed his glass on the table. "What happened last night?" Montgomery moved closer, turning his eyes to Nathaniel. "I saw lights on at the Gabriel Chapel north of the mansion. There was a group there. You seemed to be praying, but those prayers didn't sound like the ones I know." Nathaniel looked up at Montgomery. His expression was cold, blank, but condescending. "Sometimes people reach God in different ways, Father." Montgomery turned his eyes to Augustus. "What about Mariel? No one has heard from her since she disappeared." I saw her there, on the altar." Augustus narrowed his eyes. He took a deep breath, then smiled. But the smile was only superficial. His eyes were still cold. "My advice to you, Montgomery, is not to observe when you are tired. Old men like us sometimes confuse the boundary between reality and dreams." Montgomery took another step closer. "I know exactly what I saw. I've been in God's house for years, Augustus, and last night, someone was praying to something other than God." Nathaniel rose quickly from the table. The chair creaked as it was pulled back. His voice rose for the first time. "What are you accusing us of, Father? What are you implying?" Montgomery didn't flinch. He just stayed silent. He spoke without taking his eyes off Nathaniel's. "There's just one question I'm looking for an answer to. Why is there a special service in the chapel every night after someone dies?" This time, Augustus stood up. He leaned on his cane, left Nathaniel behind, and stood in front of Montgomery. He spoke in a low but threatening tone. "We pray for you, Montgomery. Sometimes the truth is too heavy to bear. And some questions, when answered, shatter not faith but reason. Don't forget that." Montgomery hesitated for a moment, a deep swallow. Then he bowed his head silently, but as he walked out the door, he left one final sentence. "If I ever witness such a service in the chapel again, I won't just pray." As the door closed behind him, Nathaniel tried not to show the tension in his throat. Augustus slowly turned back to his chair and whispered to his son with a smile. "He understands our language now, Nathaniel, like blood in his veins. But despite all this, I will try to quell Montgomery's suspicions." 2 days later, a special letter arrived at the mansion from Montgomery. The envelope bore the Whitmore family crest, and the letter was carefully handwritten. The lines ended with Augustus's signature, "Dear Father Montgomery, in light of recent concerns, we would like to invite you to a special prayer service we are organizing as a family. This service, which will benefit the entire town, is intended to purify our hearts and demonstrate our loyalty to God. We hope it will bring you peace and strengthen our brotherhood." Montgomery stood by the window for a long time, holding the letter in his hands. He was suspicious. Was it a game? Was he being lured into a trap? Or were the images in his head just the product of sleepless nights and his crumbling faith? When he arrived at the chapel for the evening service, the atmosphere was completely different this time. The interior had been cleaned, and everything had been carefully arranged. Fresh flowers had been hung on the walls, and candlesticks had been placed around the altar. Nathaniel and Augustus were there too. Instead of their wide robes, they were wearing simple black suits. They seemed like kind men, smiling at everyone. This time, Augustus led the ceremony. Classical Latin prayers were recited, and hymns were sung. It was an ordinary, even somewhat soulless ceremony. Montgomery watched with suspicion. It bore no resemblance to what he had seen before. No strange languages, no bodies lying on the stone altar. This ceremony was open and understandable to everyone. At the end of the ceremony, Augustus approached Montgomery. He placed his hand on his shoulder in a friendly manner. "Sometimes the devil whispers fears into our minds, Father. But God's house has no place for doubt, only love. The things you think you saw, your heart may have interpreted them differently. You know that people are more prone to error when they are alone." Nathaniel added softly, "Our door is always open to you. You are family." Montgomery glanced at Elena. The girl had raised her head, but there was a blankness, an indescribable distance in her eyes. At that moment, Montgomery's mind was confused. Could what he had seen really be a hallucination? Was he imagining things because of the burden of the past? And that was exactly what the Whitmore family wanted. Montgomery was no longer sure. With a momentary sadness, he said, "Well, Augustus, maybe I've been experiencing some psychological issues lately, especially with my daughter's disappearance. Maybe the events I've described are due to my poor mental state." Augustus said in a kind voice, "Don't worry, we're always here for you as a family," thinking he had dispelled Montgomery's doubts. In the days that followed, Montgomery tried to pray to forget what he had seen. He knew that his family and the families of the people who had disappeared from the town were going through difficult times. So he made a decision. He had to rebuild his faith, both for himself and for the townspeople. He started a religious education and spiritual purification community called the Resurrection Society. He renovated the back hall of the church where he served and began giving sermons, readings from the Holy Book, and talks on inner purification to the townspeople 3 days a week. Over time, the society began to attract people from all over the town. People of all ages and classes flocked to the chapel. Montgomery's voice was soft but effective, like the faith of a man tested by darkness. It was fragmented but still strong. And one day, Elena Whitmore joined the community, the young and beautiful daughter of the Whitmore family. She was quiet at first. Unlike the others, she didn't ask questions, she just listened. But when Montgomery looked at her, he saw loneliness and fear in her eyes. Or perhaps it was due to his paranoid nature. Over time, the community began to do Montgomery a lot of good. There had been no losses in the town for a long time. Montgomery had even begun to regret the words he had spoken to the Whitmores. A week later, after the prayers had ended, Montgomery was sitting in the garden when he noticed a visitor approaching from afar. Augustus Whitmore. He was wearing a jet black coat and leaning on his cane. But his gaze was not one of familiar arrogance, but rather one of careful alertness. As he wandered through the garden, he approached a woman sitting on one of the church benches. The woman was Ruth Halden, the young and beautiful sister of the village baker. Montgomery watched secretly. Augustus was asking Ruth questions almost in a whisper. The girl nodded timidly, giving answers. Augustus sometimes took notes, sometimes glanced around. He seemed harmless, but Montgomery sensed that he wasn't just observing, that he was searching for something. The next morning, Montgomery went to Ruth's house. When he couldn't find her, he found her brother, Jonathan Halden. "Where is Ruth?" he asked anxiously. Jonathan scratched his head. "You'll be surprised, but Ruth went to bed early last night. When I woke up this morning, she was gone. She left a note. She got a job and is going to start working at a bakery outside the city. She left without even saying goodbye." A chill ran through Montgomery's heart. The same story again. The same words, gone to work outside the city. Just when he was starting to believe Whitmore, Jonathan's words shook Montgomery to his core. These women leaving in the same way and never coming back. The next day after the meeting, everyone dispersed, but Elena didn't leave the church hall. Montgomery approached her. "The last girl your father spoke to here? Ruth. Have you heard anything about her?" Elena lowered her head. "No, but I think she also went to work outside the city." Her voice was hoarse. Her eyes were still vacant. Montgomery sat down next to her. "Do these words sound familiar to you, Elena?" "Sometimes. When I pray in my room at night, I hear voices from outside, someone behind the chapel, whispering something like Latin. And my father, my grandfather, they often go down into the church basement in secret." At first, Montgomery didn't want to believe what he was hearing, but the fear in Elena's eyes showed that she was sincere. After these events, a strong bond formed between Elena and Montgomery, and they began to confide in each other frequently. However, as time passed, the atmosphere at the Whitmore mansion began to change. As the weeks went by, not only did the atmosphere change, but the people did too. Especially Nathaniel's daughter, Elena Whitmore, had taken on a strange demeanor. Once cheerful and talkative, she now spent most of her days staring out the window into the void. She didn't respond to her father or the servants, her eyes fixed on a single point, as if something was calling her from within. The maid who looked after Elena said to Nathaniel one day, "Sir, The child seems to have been poisoned by the air in this house. She stares at the same empty wall all the time. When we take her outside, she only moves for a few minutes. Perhaps we should take her somewhere else. Something here is drawing the children in." Elena was silent again that morning, as usual. While the maid set the breakfast table, she stood by the window, staring at something invisible through the gray mist. Nathaniel had grown accustomed to his daughter's state. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions, but he listened. That afternoon, the old guest room on the second floor of the mansion was being cleaned. One of the servants accidentally broke the lid of an old trunk while lowering it. What came out was not just old clothes. A thick leather-bound notebook fell to the ground, its pages opening. Elena, who was passing by the room at that moment, glanced at one of the scattered pages. Her eyes widened. In the center of the page was a drawing, a stone altar. Around it were burning candles, and on it lay a figure of a woman. Below it was written only, "The contract can only be renewed with pure flesh." Upon seeing the drawings, memories of past events suddenly came to Elena's mind. She was 5 years old. It was raining. She couldn't sleep. When she went downstairs, the living room door was ajar. Inside, her grandfather Augustus, her father Nathaniel, and another man in a long robe were sitting. All three were kneeling on the floor inside a circle drawn with salt. In the center was a small bowl. Inside was a red, dark-colored liquid. Nathaniel had a feather pen in his hand. He dipped the pen into the liquid in the bowl and traced over the symbols drawn on the floor. The shapes he drew were too complex for a child to understand, but they were terrifying. She didn't remember the symbols clearly, but the shapes in the notebook stirred something unsettling in her mind. Elena had slipped upstairs unnoticed at that moment. Then she had forgotten everything. Until now. Additionally, a necklace that came out of the box reminded her of a dream she had been having for years. Since she was 8 years old, she had been seeing a woman in her dreams almost every week, asking her for help. Once the woman had given him a necklace with a star emblem on it. This necklace was exactly that necklace. Elena had told her father about the dreams she had seen in the past and said she needed psychological support. When her father heard this, his eyes popped out of their sockets and he said angrily, "No, don't tell anyone about this dream, otherwise they'll think you're crazy." Hearing this, Elena went to her room in fear. Nathaniel, who was following her, said in a trembling voice, "Come back, my daughter. I didn't mean it that way." In the days that followed, Nathaniel repeatedly emphasized to his daughter that she should tell him if she had these dreams again. However, even though Elena had these dreams frequently, she didn't tell anyone. Elena picked up the notebook from the floor amid the servants' astonished stares and quietly went to her room. She put the notebook in her locked trunk, but her hands were still trembling. At night, as she tossed and turned in bed, she began to hear a sound. This sound was not a voice in her mind. It was coming from the wall, whispers coming from the space behind the boards. Very faint, but clear. Every secret that comes to light creates darkness. Elena jumped. The whispers stopped, but she noticed a small mark on the carpet at the edge of her bed. Salt. She slowly crouched down. She touched the salt with her fingers. At that moment, another image appeared before her eyes. When she was 4 years old, one night, she and the maid Clara were returning home when they noticed that the chapel door was slightly ajar. Clara wanted to go inside and say a quick prayer. Elena went inside with her, but there was a table inside, and on that table, a young woman was lying, looking as if she were asleep. Clara immediately covered Elena's eyes. "Don't look, dear. She's just sick. She'll get better with prayers." But Elena remembered the expression on that face. It wasn't the expression of a sick person. It was the expression of a dead person. However, the next day when her beloved father told her that the woman he had invited to the house was the same woman who had been lying on the table that day, the innocent 4-year-old girl believed him. Realizing that these doubts and dreams were slowly eating away at her mind, Elena one day entered the library where her father and grandfather would often lock themselves in for hours and speak in secret. She began rummaging through everything, as if searching for a document or a file. She didn't hear the approaching footsteps of the housemaid. "Elena," the maid said softly. Startled, Elena turned around in fear. When she realized it wasn't her father, she replied in a calm voice, "Why is my father reading books about these kinds of purification rituals?" The maid didn't know how to respond. Elena picked up one of the books with skulls and bloody crosses drawn on the cover. Just then, footsteps echoed down the corridor. She quickly hid the book under her skirt. When Nathaniel entered and saw his daughter and the maid in the same room, he was surprised and asked in a stern voice, "Elena, what are you doing here?" "I was just looking for some prayer books, Father, for the people who've gone missing in the town." After a brief pause, her father said, "Go back to your room." Then, turning to the maid, he ordered, "There are places in the basement that need cleaning. Go take care of them." Later, when the maid, Mara, went down to the basement, Nathaniel followed her and suddenly raised his voice. Elena couldn't hear the conversation, but it was clear her father was angry that she had entered the library. In the days that followed, Elena began asking the old housemaid, Mara, about some of the women who had gone missing in the town in the past. Mara said that in the 1840s alone, 20 people had disappeared, all under eerily similar circumstances. They all left their homes either to look for work or to visit a relative, Mara said, and none of them ever returned. The explanations were always the same. But I know the truth. The people who had gone missing were all deeply religious. Most of them would regularly come to the family chapel to pray. Elena's grandfather and father, however, would perform rituals while they were there. After getting these answers, Elena began to recall pieces of the past. Inside the book she had taken from her father's library, she found the image of a beautiful woman. The woman looked strangely familiar to her, so she asked Mara if she recognized her. After studying the picture for a moment, Mara replied, "Yes. How could I ever forget such beauty? She was one of the women who disappeared in the 1850s. How did you find her photograph?" Hearing this, Elena was left in shock and withdrew to her room without saying a single word. Now that she had uncovered these fragments of truth, she began to suspect that her family was hiding a significant secret from the past. That photograph couldn't have ended up there by coincidence. When Nathaniel Whitmore entered the library that morning, the sun had not yet risen. With slow steps, he walked to the top shelf in the far left corner. That's where one of the most sacred, yet most secret texts of the Whitmore bloodline had been kept for over a century. Blood and Covenant. It was bound in deep burgundy leather. On its cover was a golden emblem, faded with time, 3 interlocking circles, and at their center, a burned eye. He reached out his hand and grasped empty air. Nathaniel's brow furrowed sharply. His hand went back to the same spot. Nothing. Only bare wood. His eyes darted nervously from side to side. The other books on the shelf were untouched, just as they had always been. None had been moved. Only that one was gone. A heavy feeling struck him in the throat like a clenched fist. His back stiffened. His palms began to sweat. He slowly lifted his head and whispered, "That book was never meant to be seen." With a trembling, furious hand, he pulled the bell cord from the drawer of his desk. Only minutes later, someone entered the room with slow, heavy steps. It was Mara. She wore a headscarf and held a silver dustpan in her hand, but there was a look on her face, a mix of hesitation and unease. Nathaniel studied her closely. This woman was far too quiet. She moved through every room like one of the shadows, often working for hours without speaking a single word. She was the type who saw too much and said too little. She was like a ghost. "I didn't do anything, sir. But if someone did, then that person carries your blood. Maybe someone wants to uncover your secrets." The recent string of disappearances involving women in the town had begun to attract not only the attention of the locals, but also of officials from outside. Streets fell into silence, houses shut their doors earlier than usual, and townsfolk avoided conversation, as if the entire place was whispering that something was very, very wrong. And so, by mid-autumn, the town was buried in silence. But it was a silence born not of peace, but of fear. The missing women didn't just vanish, they left behind a deep and lingering mystery. The first to disappear was Luisa Bellotti, who made her living selling handmade soap. As she did every morning, she slung her basket over her arm and set off for the market. But that morning, she never returned. No scream had been heard, no trace was found. Her husband only discovered the empty basket she used to carry the soaps, lying in the bushes along the forest path. 2 days later, Rosa Mantini, a young woman who sold flowers in the village square, went missing. She had told someone she was going out for a short walk around noon. Her footprints could be traced all the way to the stone road that led to the manor, and then they vanished into the dirt. The last person to see her was an old woman from town who said, "A carriage approached. Rosa stopped, as if she were speaking to someone she knew, then they both disappeared together." The third disappearance was the most frightening. Bianca, the tailor's daughter, had been sitting with 3 of her friends by the riverside during the cool evening. As the sun began to set, she stood up and said, "I'll be right back," before heading toward the forest path. A few minutes later, her friends called out for her, but there was no response. They ran, they shouted, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. By then, the town was swirling with whispers. Everyone was afraid, but no one dared speak openly, because the things being said were too serious. Nathaniel Whitmore had been seen several nights walking the forest path, away from the manor, and some began to believe he was the last person to see those women alive. One morning, Montgomery was in the town square when an old woman approached him. With a trembling voice, she whispered, "They were putting Rosa into a carriage at night. The man driving it was Nathaniel. We locked eyes, but I didn't see anything." At that moment, Montgomery understood. The missing women were no coincidence. The Whitmore family definitely had a hand in these disappearances. As Montgomery walked through the back courtyard of the church that morning, he heard screams rising from the village square. He ran toward the crowd and saw that everyone had gathered around a single point, staring. Right in the center of the square stood an old coffin made of cracked, weathered wood. There were no markings, no inscriptions, no symbols on it. The lid hadn't fully closed, and a piece of lace fabric was hanging from its edge. As one man stepped forward and carefully lifted the lid, a collective scream erupted from the crowd. Inside was a woman, her eyes wide open, staring blankly at the sky. Her hands were folded across her chest, but her face was frozen in terror. It was the same woman who had come to Montgomery just a day earlier, whispering to him about Rosa's disappearance. That same trembling voice, that same fragile body, but now completely silent. The inside of the coffin looked entirely dry, and there were no visible wounds on her body. But just below her neck, etched into her skin, was a small symbol, a pitchfork turned upside down, inside a circle. Montgomery's heart clenched. He had seen that symbol before, in the notebook. This was no longer a silent ritual working in the shadows. The Whitmore family wasn't just silencing those who spoke, they were making an example out of them. These events shook Elena to her core. One night, she awoke with a start. The room was freezing, yet the window was shut. Still, the curtain swayed gently. She felt a tightness in her chest, as if someone had quietly tried to wake her. Her eyes moved toward the old mirror hanging on the opposite wall. Normally, its reflection was dull and faded, but now it was eerily clear, and something was off. Her reflection was missing. A chill ran through her body as she rose from her bed and approached the mirror. There was no reflection of her, but behind her, she saw a different room. It looked nothing like any part of the manor. Its stone walls flickered in candlelight. A glowing circle filled with symbols gleamed on the floor, and on a stone altar, a girl in a white dress lay standing upright. Her head was bowed, arms hanging still at her sides. Elena took a deep breath. "Is that me?" Suddenly, the girl in the mirror lifted her head and looked straight at Elena. It was Elena, but her eyes were pitch black, her skin pale as death. Her lips moved, whispering a word, but no sound came. Elena stumbled backward, her heart pounding. She could feel it. Something had changed. As the vision in the mirror faded, a whisper rose in the room. "When the moon returns, the door will open." The next day, Elena told Mara about her dreams. But Mara wasn't all that surprised. After all, Elena had struggled with psychological issues since childhood. She believed these dreams were just symptoms of her illness. One night, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay awake until late, thinking about her family's secret. At around 4 a.m., she heard footsteps in the hallway. Her father, grandfather, and several siblings were dressed in black and walking away from the mansion with stern expressions on their faces. She knew that her grandfather had been keeping his old notebooks in the same place for years, in a small safe hidden behind the old family portrait hanging above the fireplace in the bedroom. That safe could only be opened with Augustus's special key, and Elena knew that he usually carried that key on a chain around his neck. But when he was going outside the mansion, he secretly left the key among the Bibles in his study. Though she couldn't stop her hands from trembling, she finally opened the box. She took out an old leather-bound diary. It was written in a mixture of Latin. As she turned the pages, her blood ran cold. This was the dark history of the Whitmore family. According to the diary, the family had made a deal with the local church in 1800. In exchange for divine protection of their lineage, they would offer purity sacrifices at regular intervals. These were usually virgin girls dedicated to God. Though it didn't appear to be a ritual murder, that was the essence of it. The girls were drugged with a herbal mixture. Then their blood was transferred into a sacred chalice and consumed by the men of the family in a secret ceremony. According to the family, this was the path to purification from earthly sins and direct access to heaven. The last victim was chosen in 1862, according to records. However, what truly shook Elena was another tradition. If a daughter of the family had not married by the age of 25, she would be chosen as the final sacrifice to ensure the continuation of the pure bloodline. Elena was 24 years old and unmarried. Her birthday was only a year away. That morning, when Elena Whitmore slipped into the library through the stone-paved back hall of the mansion, she was not merely searching for books. For days, her father, Nathaniel, and her grandfather, Augustus, had been whispering, locking doors, and staying in their rooms until midnight. Hiding behind a bookshelf in the library, she listened intently. "As the new moon approaches, another preparation must be made," said Augustus's familiar icy voice. "Eloise is inadequate. She is not yet ready. Another woman is needed, one of the chosen ones, one who obeys without even looking up." Nathaniel's voice was more anxious. "We can't afford to make a mistake this time. The town is already whispering. The servants are listening in. Marielle is still being talked about." Just then, the door opened. A man in a long robe entered. Elena recognized him immediately. Father Lucan. He was a large man who served at the other church in town, and everyone feared him. But Elena's eyes focused on his hands. His fingers were stained with black ink, just like the hands that wrote the sex ledgers. Lucan bowed his head slightly. "The sacrifice is ready. The laundress's daughter, Maria Alvento. Her mother is sick. The child works alone all day in the lower part of the village. If she disappears, no one will miss her, and her sick mother will soon die." The next day, Montgomery was mowing the lawn in the garden when he was startled by a faint voice behind him. Elena was waiting for him behind the old stone wall. "Mr. Montgomery, please, I need to tell you something, but not here. No one should see us. Let's meet at sunset, outside the village next to the abandoned old mill." That evening, Elena told him everything in a trembling voice. What she had heard in the library, the priest's arrival, the selection of the sacrifice. The priest was someone Montgomery trusted. He had taken lessons from him since childhood and had spent good times with his missing daughter. When Montgomery heard this, he couldn't believe it. "So what I saw was real too," he said, and told the girl what he had seen in the church. Then Elias explained what was in the notebook. "And Maria, that child, she'll be next." Montgomery said they had to stop these events. Montgomery thought, "There's Father Michael, the priest of the main church. He's known for his honesty. Maybe we can get his help." Elias hesitated. Revealing his family could destroy his entire inheritance, even his life. But he couldn't ignore it anymore. "All right," he said, "but we need proof. My words alone won't be enough." They made a plan. Elena would try to secretly take photos of her father's journal and books. Jonah would search for the hidden passage beneath the church. The evidence they found there might be enough to expose the family. But the next day, everything turned upside down. Nathaniel Whitmore turned to Elena at dinner and said, "Elena, I have made my decision. We are arranging your engagement to Sebastian of the Huxley family in June. The negotiations are complete. It will be a great honor for our family." Elena froze. Her family had realized she was suspicious. They wanted to remove her from the mansion under the pretense of marriage. That night, Elena made her decision. She would escape. She would act immediately to save Maria. 3 days later, Elena pretended to be ill and went to her room early. When midnight came, she quietly opened the window, climbed down using the rope ladder she had hidden beforehand. Montgomery was waiting for her in the barn. He had a lantern and some excavation tools with him. Together they headed toward the family chapel. When they looked inside through the windows, they saw Elena's father, Richard Augustus, and two other men preparing for a ritual around the altar. And right in the center lay Maria, unconscious, dressed in white. "We have to go now," whispered Elena. "No," said Montgomery. "If we go in now, they will sacrifice us too. First we need evidence, otherwise the secret will go to the grave with us." They circled around the chapel and found an old stone door beneath the bushes. There was a staircase leading down. With trembling hands they lit the lantern and descended quietly. Below was a large room surrounded by stone walls. Latin inscriptions and crosses were carved into the walls. Wooden coffins were lined up in the wall niches. Each coffin was engraved with a woman's name and a date. Elena counted. There were exactly 53 coffins. In the center was a pitch-black stone altar. It was covered in old bloodstains. Women's clothing from years ago was carefully hung on the walls. The most terrifying thing was the notebook on the altar. When Elena opened it, she saw handwritten lists of victims, names, ages, dates, and dedicated for the purpose of purification. On the last line, she read May 8th, 1963. Susan, 19 years old, virgin purification ritual for the Whitmore bloodline. Elena no longer had any doubts. Tonight Grace would either be saved or Elias would be forever buried in the darkness of this house. While Elena was lost in thought, footsteps echoed from above. The stones of the staircase groaned. Elena turned off the lantern. They hid behind a few coffins with Montgomery. In the dim light of the candelabras, two figures appeared, Nathaniel Whitmore and Augustus. Nathaniel was carrying a young woman, motionless in his arms. "Maria, it is time to prepare bed number 54, said Augustus in a heavy voice. "The purification is complete. My daughter's veins will now carry pure blood." The priest silently began preparing an empty niche. Nathaniel placed Maria's body into a coffin engraved with silver patterns. Elena bit her hand to stay silent and hold back her anger. "Nathaniel," said Augustus suddenly, "I am worried about Elena. She acted strangely today, as if she had understood something. If she has learned our secrets, it would not be good for her or our family." Nathaniel paused. "I noticed too, but it is too late now. Soon she will be in another city, living another life. This secret will go to the grave with us, as always." "What if she talks?" asked Augustus. Nathaniel smirked. "She is a Whitmore. There is no betrayal in our blood. Besides, who would believe such nonsense? We are the most respected family in town." Elena's breath grew shallow. To rid herself of the betrayal her family had committed against her, she stood up and accidentally knocked over one of the coffins. The crash echoed through the crypt. A cloud of dust surrounded the room. The two men turned instantly. "Who is there?" shouted Nathaniel. Elena stepped out of the darkness. Montgomery followed bravely behind. Her father and daughter locked eyes. Between them hung not just silence, but the entire past. "Elena," he said, his voice cracked, "you were not supposed to be here." "And Maria was not supposed to die," replied Elena, suppressing her fear, "nor the 53 women before her. All were sacrificed for your disgusting purification game. You are a murderer, and I am ashamed to share your blood." Nathaniel's face suddenly collapsed, his eyes staring into emptiness. "You don't understand," he said. "We did this to protect our family. The blood had to remain pure. This was our sacred duty." "Sacred," Elena shouted. "Did God command you to kill innocent women?" Augustus lunged forward, a wild expression on his face. But Montgomery was faster. He struck Augustus on the head with the shovel. Augustus collapsed unconscious. Nathaniel's gaze turned once more to his daughter. He was broken. Something inside him shattered at that moment. 53 souls, he whispered. 53 girls. All of it for us, for our family, for you and your future. But now, it's all over. He walked to the wall and took down a torch. Elena immediately understood what he was about to do. "No, father, do not do this, I am your daughter," she screamed, but it was too late. Nathaniel threw the torch onto the pile of cloth in the corner. Flames spread instantly. The dry rags and old coffins fed the fire. "Run!" shouted Montgomery. He grabbed Elena by the arm and dragged her toward the stairs. Behind them, hell was rising. Even the upper floor of the chapel was shaking. When they climbed the stairs, they saw the roof had caught fire. They ran off into the night. As she turned to look one last time, Elena saw her father standing motionless in the flames. as if he wanted to punish himself, as if he wanted to apologize to his daughter, not with words, but with his actions. Father Montgomery was trying to rise from the ashes on the floor, but found no way to escape. The flames had blocked his path too. The chapel burned all through the night. By dawn, when help arrived, nothing remained but ashes. Among the ruins, the bodies of Augustus, Whitmore, and Nathaniel were found. Alongside them were charred coffin remnants and dozens of skeletal fragments. The authorities recorded them as remnants of a medieval cemetery. Elena Whitmore never married Sebastian. 3 days after the fire, she left the town with Montgomery. They were never seen again, Nathaniel's sons. Richard and Samuel abandoned the mansion after their father's death. The Whitmore estate was gradually sold off. The family name quietly faded into silence, but the elders of Hollowbrook still speak. The night the chapel burned, some say they saw silhouettes running through the fields, heard screams. Others say they still hear whispers of women from the ruins at night.